Okay, let's dive in. Think about this date. October 2nd, 1919. On the surface, maybe just another day post-Great War.
Mhm.
But behind the closed doors of the White House, something pretty dramatic happens. President Woodrow Wilson has a stroke, a really bad one.
Yeah, a massive stroke leaves him paralyzed, largely unable to speak. It's a huge personal blow, obviously.
But the really strange part, the part that makes this such a fascinating historical moment, is what didn't happen next.
Exactly. No big public announcement about his condition, not really. And crucially, no formal transfer of power. The government just kept going.
It just kept ticking along. And right in the middle of all this, you have the First Lady, Edith Wilson.
She becomes this absolutely central figure, sort of the gatekeeper for the president, controlling access, controlling information.
Which really sets up the big question for us today, doesn't it? How much did Edith Wilson actually, run the country during that time? Was she effectively the acting president?
It's a complex question. There's a lot to unpack there about power, influence, and what happens when the normal rules don't quite apply.
So let's get some context. 1919, Wilson is absolutely consumed by the League of Nations. It's his passion project after the war.
Oh, completely. He saw it as the path to future peace, his major legacy. And he throws himself into this incredibly demanding tour across the country to sell it to the American people.
Just grueling, right? Speaking constantly, traveling nonstop.
Totally grueling. And, his health wasn't great to begin with. This tour just pushed him over the edge. He collapses in Colorado in late September.
Rush back to Washington,
Yeah.
And then, bam, October 2nd, the stroke hits.
And it's severe. We're talking paralysis on his left side. His speech is heavily impaired. This isn't like, a minor illness he could push through. It fundamentally changed his ability to function as president.
And critically, back then, there was no roadmap for this, constitutionally speaking.
None whatsoever.
Yeah.
This is decades before the 25th Amendment, which now gives us procedures for presidential disability.
Right.
So in 1919, there's just silence. No clear process for saying the president is incapacitated. No clear way for the vice president, Thomas Marshall, to formally step in.
A real vacuum.
A constitutional vacuum, yes. And that's the stage upon which Edith Wilson steps forward. Now, she was his second wife, very close to him, deeply involved even before the stroke. More so than many first ladies, perhaps.
Okay, so she was already somewhat in the loop politically.
Definitely more than just a social hostess. She understood his thinking, but after the stroke, her role just explodes. She becomes the sole channel to the president.
The gatekeeper, you mentioned that. So visitors, documents, memos, everything goes through her.
Pretty much everything.
Yeah.
She decided who could see him, which was almost no one initially, and what papers he should look at, or rather, what papers she would present to him.
How did she describe her own role?
She later called it a stewardship. Her argument was that she was protecting her husband, shielding him from stress, helping him conserve his energy, and essentially interpreting his will on matters of state.
Interpreting his will. That sounds like a position of significant power, doesn't it? Especially if the person you're interpreting can barely communicate.
That's the crux of it. She maintained she wasn't making decisions for him, just figuring out what he wanted. But how much interpretation is needed when someone is that ill? And crucially, there was no independent medical assessment of his fitness to govern made public or presented to Congress. Her word was basically it.
So Washington must have been a strange place. Outwardly, government business continues.
Right. Departments are issuing statements, bills are being discussed, but inside the White House, it's this very tightly controlled environment. Congress, certainly the public, had little idea just how incapacitated Wilson truly was.
Were cabinet members shut out too?
Reports suggest yes. Many key cabinet members found it incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to get direct access to Wilson himself. Communications supposedly from Wilson were often routed through Edith.
And did she write them or edit them?
There's historical debate and evidence suggesting she certainly had a hand in drafting or heavily editing communications that went out under his name. So the question becomes, are these really Wilson's decisions filtered through Edith, or are they, to some extent, Edith's decisions presented as Wilson's?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Historians are kind of split. Some argue she really did step up and make policy choices, deal with appointments, maybe even some diplomacy.
While others argue she was more of a devoted, protective spouse, doing what she genuinely believed was best for him and what she thought he would want, based on very limited interactions. Maybe just a nod or a faint word.
But the key point remains the American people were flying blind. They had no clue their president was so severely disabled.
Absolutely. The secrecy is a massive part of this story.
Okay, let's talk about the League of Nations again. Wilson's baby. His health crisis hits at the worst possible time for the treaty fight.
Couldn't be worse. Opposition in the Senate is hardening. You've got Henry Cabot Lodge leading the charge, really concerned about losing American autonomy, getting entangled in European affairs.
Here, Wilson, the master orator, the guy who could maybe sway public opinion or negotiate, he's completely sidelined.
He's physically unable to fight for it. He can't engage in their political give and make, the compromises that might have been necessary to get some version of the treaty passed.
And Edith's role in this?
Well, by her own account and others, she was fiercely protective of Wilson's original vision. She believed, perhaps rightly based on his personality, that he wouldn't want any compromise on the key points of the League Covenant.
So she resisted attempts to modify the treaty.
That seems to be the case. She saw compromise as a betrayal of his principles. Now, you could see that as loyalty, but did that inflexibility, driven by her interpretation of his wishes, ultimately doom the League in the U.S.? It's a strong possibility.
Because the end result was?
The Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles. The U.S. never joined the League of Nations. It was a massive blow to Wilson personally and politically, and it arguably shifted America's global role for decades.
And it's hard not to link that failure, at least partly, back to the president's condition and the way Edith managed the situation.
The connection seems pretty clear, yeah. The power vacuum, the inability to negotiate, the staunch defense of an uncompromising position, it all played a role.
How long did this secrecy last? When did the full story start to come out?
It took a while. I mean, during the remainder of his term, the extent of his illness wasn't fully appreciated publicly. After he left office, and especially after his death in 1924, bits and pieces started emerging. Edith's own memoirs later gave her perspective, though obviously framed to protect her and her husband's legacy.
And that's when people really started debating her actions.
Exactly. Was she this incredibly devoted wife doing her best in an impossible situation? Or was she, maybe without even fully intending it, acting as an unelected president, wielding executive power without a mandate?
Is there definitive proof she was making major policy calls entirely on her own?
Definitive proof is tricky. It's not like there's a memo saying, I, Edith, have decided this, but the circumstantial evidence, the control she exerted, the way communications flowed, the outcomes like the League fight, it paints a picture of immense influence at the very least.
So maybe de facto first female president is too strong, but...
It's provocative, right? It certainly highlights the unprecedented level of power she held. Whether she consciously sought it or simply filled a void out of loyalty, the fact remains, for about 18 months, the First Lady was arguably the most powerful person filtering information and access to the incapacitated president.
It really exposes a vulnerability, doesn't it? How much can depend on the health and capacity of just one person at the top?
Absolutely, and it serves as a cautionary tale. This whole episode, this crisis, was a major catalyst eventually for the 25th Amendment.
Ratified way later, in 1967.
Right, decades later. But the memory of the Wilson situation, the confusion, the potential for hidden influence that lingered. The 25th Amendment finally created clear steps for what happens if a president becomes disabled. It was a direct response to this kind of dangerous ambiguity.
So looking back, the key thing for you to take away is just how extraordinary Edith Wilson's role was. Mostly hidden at the time, but hugely consequential.
It forces you to think about power, how it operates, sometimes invisibly, and who steps up when the official structures falter.
And here's something to maybe mull over. Imagine a similar situation happening today, before the 25th Amendment existed. How might things play out? What does this whole affair tell us about how fragile leadership can sometimes be?
It really does give you pause. History is full of these moments where the unexpected happens and the human element becomes paramount.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into a really fascinating and often overlooked piece of American history.
It's a story worth remembering, definitely.
We hope you keep thinking about Edith Wilson and the questions her story raises about power and governance.